Good afternoon. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We are delighted that you're able to join us today for the third webinar in our special ABEP webinar series titled Preparing Psychology for 2050, Building a More Equitable, Diverse, Inclusive, and Representative Leadership. I want to take a second to acknowledge ABEP and thank them for the great work we've accomplished together since our partnership began in December 2021. The Trust and ABEP are similar in many ways, especially when it comes to supporting psychologists and the profession of psychology. I look forward to continuing this mutually beneficial relationship by creating informative content like this webinar. Today's webinar is being presented by Dr. Lynette Abrams Silva, who is a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist licensed in both New Mexico and Illinois. She is the director of the Psychology Department Clinic at the University of New Mexico, overseeing clinical training experiences of graduate students, as well as teaching several graduate-level courses through the Psychology Department. She also provides comprehensive clinical and forensic neuropsychological evaluations for adults in her private practice in Albuquerque. We're certainly in for a wonderful treat. I know that Dr. Abrams Silva is passionate about this topic, and we will benefit from her passion and her expertise and learning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abrams Silva.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So yes, I am Dr. Abrams Silva in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And just a couple of reminders, I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest. And we have a couple of learning objectives. One is to increase knowledge of historical and current barriers to leadership experienced by psychologists from marginalized backgrounds. And the second is to be able to explain the approaches ranging from individual mentorship to working for systemic change that aim to overcome or eliminate these barriers. A little prologue, diversity. I acknowledge that diversity encompasses many factors beyond culture and ethnicity, and the American Psychological Association rightly recognizes the broad scope of race, ethnicity, language, sex, gender, age, disability status, religious, spiritual affiliation, and more. However, my focus, as may be evident from my own leadership position as the chair of Division 40's Ethnic Minority Affairs Committee, has been on socio-ethnocultural factors. And so this talk will primarily focus on these aspects of what I acknowledge to be a greater diversity, which is not meant to minimize or discount any other factors. So that was my disclaimer about the particular facets of diversity that are included in my talk with I have no intention of minimizing other factors. This is just what I happen to be focused on in my career. So we can start then with that caveat of looking at the US Census 2022 estimate for the US population, which is probably not a surprise to anyone. Just a bit of review. I do want to present a few slides that are pertaining to demographics of the US currently, in the future, what psychology looks like, just to provide a little bit of background. So this is where we were estimated to have been last year, and this is where we are projected to be in 2050, when the United States population is hypothesized to become a majority minority nation. How does this relate to the profession of psychology? I imagine everyone who works in psychology has an idea of why this is important. But I think looking at ourselves for a moment before we continue is also a good thing to keep in mind, which in 2019, the APA Center for Workforce Studies compiled some demographics on us, we psychologists, and this is how we are predicted to look today based on those numbers. And this actually has remained relatively stable since about 2009, meaning that the diversification of the field of psychology has been outpaced by the diversification of the United States. And you can see how that works. These are the numbers today on the left of the US population versus our own demographics within psychology. So we've not kept up with the representation for current US demographics, and this potentially stagnates our worldview as a field. Models for leadership in psychology have typically been grounded in a particular Western European worldview. And this, among several other factors, has resulted in non-representation of people of color in the field of psychology. And this is even more pronounced within leadership, which results in perpetuating the status quo and limits how effective we are at leading the new generations of psychologists that are increasingly socioculturally, ethnically diverse, as well as directing the research and intervention development in appropriate trajectories that will capture a broader range of human experience and behavior and promote increased cultural competence among psychologists. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the current barriers to diversity in leadership, which again, probably not completely unknown to most of you, but I wanted to examine some of them, particularly in the context of some historical factors and how we can start to overcome these barriers. Whenever I teach assessment, which I teach every other semester, I tend to talk a lot about where we as a field come from, because the field of psychology really grew up around assessment. I know it's probably been a long time for most of us since our undergraduate intro to psych class, but I feel like history is really important to remember, and noting where our worldview is rooted can help us to understand why we have the barriers we have and how we might address them better. Our roots really go back probably further than this, but the first time we really ended up measuring things we could not see that are pertinent to psychology was by Francis Galton, who was British aristocracy, father of psychometrics, bequeather of the phrase nature versus nurture, and enthusiastic eugenicist. From these beginnings is embedded, to some extent, our concept of leadership. In fact, Francis Galton had a theory of leadership, which he wrote about in Hereditary Genius in 1869. And really, it was very trait-based, the idea of being a leader. And he stated that traits of leaders were heritable, immutable, and unteachable. And as you can imagine, had this been followed to the letter, leaders would be homogenous, no diversity at all. And the reason I bring this up in the classes I teach is the same reason I bring it up today. If we forget our roots, no matter how uncomfortable they make us, we allow for an insidious influence to guide how we develop moving forward. So whatever obstacles we might have, our history is the umbrella under which they all reside. So we are fighting 200 years or more of history when we try to diversify leadership in our field, which isn't to say there is nothing we can do, but we can start by examining some of the more prominent barriers, keeping in mind that our entire profession did grow up from a particular worldview. The first one that I'm going to talk about, the first barrier, is perhaps somewhat obvious, which is just the lack of representation in the field overall. I just showed you our demographics demonstrating that psychology has not kept up with current US demographics, much less on track to meet the ones that are bearing down on us from 2050. It is still a very popular college major. Psychology is consistently ranked in the top 5 most popular college majors. And between college, and many might argue starting before college, there is what has been called a broken pipeline, particularly for those from diverse backgrounds. I've heard it called the broken pipeline, the leaky pipeline. Essentially what it means is we're losing students of color from the undergraduate level, or we never get them in the undergraduate level in the first place. For example, this survey in 2018, 12% of psych majors were self-identified as Black, but only 7.1% of doctoral students identified as the same. Are students of color applying to graduate school and not getting in, or are they not applying to graduate school? Both are likely, and even once encouraged to apply and admitted to graduate school, there are attrition rates to worry about, and we have found higher attrition rates for Hispanic and Black students. So one significant barrier to leadership positions within psychology is the barrier to the field of psychology from the start. Not only does this create a less representative pool from which to draw leaders in the field, it keeps leadership a bit on the homogenous side, which perpetuates a system that favors those already in it. A second major barrier is the lack of visible or adequate existing diversity in leadership. If you look at the demographics of psychology by career stage, our earlier career psychologists are more diverse, but less likely overall to pursue leadership positions, due in part probably career stage, being early career, but also we're finding reports of the lack of existing diversity in leadership representing a barrier to pursuing positions in leadership, which is an interesting Ouroboros of a problem. Sorry, my slide is not advancing. There we go. The third is the leadership model or models that we tend to use within the field of psychology. I want to go back again to a bit of history with non-advancing slides. There we go. Starting with the Great Man, which Carlyle first put forth and then turned into Traits Leadership by Galton in 1869. Some of these ideas from 1800s leadership models actually still do persist, like the idea of having unique characteristics. As you can predict, that type of model favors those who represent the majority mainstream culture, particularly because we are talking about constructs like leadership qualities. And these, as you can imagine, can vary widely from one culture to the next. For example, some cultures consider extroversion better for leadership, and some consider introversion better for leadership. So, depending on the culture from which we are drawing, we really we don't have consistent constructs of what traits and characteristics and leadership qualities should be across the board, which, of course, if we default to the mainstream, perpetuates that particular system. The second question about leadership models is, how do we choose our leaders? Sometimes they're appointed, sometimes we vote them in. Both methods have their upsides and downsides, and both tend to depend on how well one understands and navigates the system that's already in place. Whether you're appointed by someone within the system or you have to run for an election that is promoted by the system, you have to be able to navigate the system that's already in place, which can be difficult for people less familiar with that system. There have, of course, been many models of leadership that have been developed and written about since then. And in fact, in 2007, the American Psychologist devoted an entire issue to leadership. And it contains a review of leadership models, which is an interesting read. So if you're interested in seeing the different types that had been developed up to that point, this is a good review of that. However, criticism was swift after it was published, and the primary criticism was there was a lack of attention to diverse leaders. So, the models that we use and the models that we write about, at least up until 2007, did not include the more diverse friendly types of models. There are certainly more barriers than this, absolutely. But I chose to focus on these because they have a shared characteristic. And I'm pretty sure that you probably noticed it, but I also kind of slipped it in there, which is each of these tends to fold back and contribute to itself, which I called momentarily ago, the Ouroboros. So for example, in my number 2 barrier, I'm essentially saying to increase diversity in leadership, we need to increase diversity in leadership. This quality of some of these barriers no doubt contributes to the challenges we face in removing them and addressing them. I know that hundreds of people have been working on these issues for many, many years, and this quality of feeling endless can feel very overwhelming and makes it perhaps seem that we cannot do anything more than we have already done. But I think that we can, actually. There are ways to address these barriers to diversity in leadership. And I think that the start is to understand that we come from a particular worldview, and many of these issues contribute to the perpetuation of themselves. I know. Deep breath. We're going to talk about how we're going to address them. The first suggestions I have are actually on an individual scale, but it is far better on the individual scale to have organizational support. That makes these efforts by the individual and even groups of individuals much easier. And then there are bigger organizational changes that may be a little bit more challenging to implement, but some of them are actually already happening. So let's start with some individual things that people can do. To go back to the broken pipeline for those from diverse backgrounds, the authors of this article had recommendations, and the very first recommendation was outreach and mentoring of ethnic minority students at the undergraduate level. Others after this have recommended starting even earlier, starting in high school. High school exposure actually for psychology typically is included in AP or honors classes, which is already something of an exclusionary model because students of color have barriers to those classes. Plus there are unawareness or feeling intimidated by the system of education. And this can be particularly true for first generation college students of any other kind of background. And then, students of color may have had negative encounters with psychology and psychiatry or any sort of mental health, because as we know, for example, Black males are overdiagnosed with intellectual disability and schizophrenia, which may be off-putting if one wants to consider a career in psychology. Prior bad experiences may dissuade students from pursuing this kind of degree. Psychologists of color engaging in talks, activities, mentoring of high school students and college students and graduate students may help overcome this barrier. However, it is something of a two-edged sword because, like many diversity initiatives, this idea of outreach by psychologists of color does place the burden of improving EDI on people of color. And we know this is actually a widespread issue. For example, non-white, non-male, and first-generation faculty disproportionately reported engaging in and contributing to diversity and inclusion in this particular article in 2019. I think it's really important to note that the majority of respondents felt that their EDI efforts were valued by their institution, which I think represents change in a positive direction. But they also felt that their EDI work did not factor into tenure decisions. So there is the need for individuals to engage in outreach, and also the need for organizations and institutions to encourage and reward outreach, which may help offset some of the additional burden on psychologists of color, and having support from colleagues, both practical, organizational, existential, grammatical, all types of support from colleagues is always valuable and may increase the volume and the effectiveness of these outreach efforts. So that really is individual supported by the institution. Included in that suggestion was mentorship. Mentorship has many different approaches, just like clinical supervision and models of leadership. One of the more popular models is the developmental approach, which focuses on stages of progression and essentially is summed up as you meet them where they are and you help get them where they need to be. Usually this is individually tailored to strengths, weaknesses, and traits. And here, traits, it's also useful to include in the idea of traits a trainee or mentee's background and context. And promoting independence and development of professional identity within that context and modeling behavior for trainees. Leaders in the field specifically mentoring junior colleagues of color, particularly those who have less familiarity with academia and our national organizations, is one way to scaffold against the lack of critical mass in leadership already that helps to overcome that particular barrier. And I recognize that this can be challenging for everyone involved. I've heard many express concern that they are not personally the best choice to mentor a junior colleague of color if they are not one themselves. Additionally, modeling can be challenging for psychologists of color who have had to navigate the system in a variety of ways at a different time and to varying degrees of discomfort. But despite these reservations that everyone may have, we know that mentorship matters. There's a whole literature on the benefits of what we know that mentorship can provide. It has been shown to increase diversity in leadership across industries, not just in psychology, contributes to the overall doctoral psychology program satisfaction of students. It helps mentees successfully navigate patriarchal or biased systems, and specifically improves career mobility for women of color, plus a lot of other things. This is just an example, but we do know that mentorship matters. And I think it's been a positive change in the last few years that there are mentorship programs popping up throughout our organizations in the field. And that's very encouraging. We do have one of our own in Division 40, the Ethnic Minority Affairs Committee mentorship program. I have to give credit where credit is due. This was the brainchild of my colleague, Michelle Medor. And I think it was very successful in that we were able to match mentors and mentees for positive experiences for both on both sides. And we learned some very interesting things from specifically the mentees. We matched 57 pairs of mentors and mentees, and we had surveys at 3 and 18 months. And there were some select themes that could be very informative for the future that mentees expressed. For example, mentees preferred a relationship that was not time limited. Yes, goal-based, but not necessarily time limited, even after the outlined goal was achieved. And this goes to a second theme that we found reported, which was mentees really reported feeling the value was in being invested in, not necessarily just get you through this next stage, but actually personally invested in their success. Others reported, or other issues that they reported feeling were very positive, when the mentor engaged their network to assist and support the mentee. I think that this goes to that unfamiliarity with particular systems that are already in place. Having the mentor help guide them through that was deemed very valuable by mentees. When the mentor advocated for them, and feeling validated when the mentor characterized their goals as attainable. And particularly just that representation in general, the shared experience with other psychologists of color. And it didn't seem to matter if the mentor and the mentee were matched on race, ethnicity. Just seeing other sociocultural racial minorities as psychologists was deemed very valuable by the mentees. So again, just mere representation was helpful. For those interested in mentoring students of color, but who hesitate to do so in a cross-cultural sort of way, there is a growing body of literature about this, and there are resources for culturally informed mentorship with suggestions for additional training that might be useful, like racial ethnic self-awareness, anti-racist, and culture and academia training. So there are actually supports in place for those who hesitate to get involved, feeling that maybe they are not the best choice. We know that mentorship is very valuable. So I would actually encourage anyone who's interested to pursue it despite any hesitations, because we do see the value time and again. Things that organizations can do, which again, these are bigger projects that may take a little bit more work and a little bit more collaboration to implement, but can be very effective, include infrastructure. Everything that I just said about the individual, having an infrastructure within an organization that supports and promotes these things like outreach, mentorship, allyship, can help increase the amount of those things that is actually done, and can, again, when the burden falls to people of color to increase EDI, this can help offset some of that burden when there is incentive and when one is rewarded, like in promotion. Admissions is a particularly tricky barrier to overcome, and it is a well-worn path. I imagine most psychologists working in institutions have walked this path at some point, and so I don't necessarily feel going over every detail is necessary. I feel like everyone is aware that admissions criteria can be biased and present multiple barriers to diversity in the field. Historically, the criteria have been more associated with higher levels of privilege and access to quality education, like GRE scores, GPA, the prestige of the undergraduate institution, and people recommending the student for admission who are well known or well recognized in the field. Increasingly, we have seen that programs are discontinuing the requirement for GRE scores. Some of that did have to do with the pandemic, but some were actually beginning to discontinue that criterion before the pandemic. And that does seem to remove some of the barrier, knowing that standardized assessments that are academically based do favor those with access to higher quality education. In the past year, a new model for evaluating applicants came to my attention because we can't necessarily just throw out all criteria for admissions. We have to replace it with something. And I have to admit, I did not know about this model for evaluating applicants until it was brought to my attention by another colleague of mine. Credit where credit is due. Stephanie Towns let me know about something called distance traveled. As we know, socioeconomic status is a strong determinant of educational and occupational attainment, income level, and various definitions of success. Even Francis Galton actually acknowledged this a few years before he wrote about leadership being immutable in 1865, and stated that, yes, those who have higher socioeconomic status can bequeath that to their children who have more access to education and positions of leadership. Some schools are already using this. Medical and graduate school applicants are considered on different metrics. They are considered to have traveled further from their social class origins. And this is theorized to represent particular characteristics, possibly greater perseverance to get to this point, to travel that far. There are constructs discussed in this literature referred to as hardiness, grit, courage, and commitment. In fact, hardiness and grit have been examined and have been shown to be important for military leadership. I know that psychology is a little bit different than the military, but this is something that is becoming more widely used, particularly with medical school admissions. The question we have to ask ourselves as psychologists, if we consider changing our criteria, are there other predictors of success than the ones we've used in the past, like GPA, test scores, social capital? There seems to be evidence of this, starting with medical school admissions, and other graduate school programs have started to implement this as well. Can we use these in place of the rather biased criteria that we were using before? The thought being, if there are characteristics that allow someone to travel a greater distance, and we add opportunities to that, we should have pretty good outcomes. We can craft this. We don't have to just rely on a GPA to predict what will happen next. If we increase the diversity of psychologists by pulling for these characteristics that have been shown to be associated with successful leadership, then we have a more diverse, stronger pool of possible leaders in the field. But I have to point out and emphasize that it is opportunities. It isn't just the characteristics. This model is becoming increasingly popular for medical school admissions, and there is some evidence for positive student outcomes. This may be useful to implement for doctoral program admissions, and also when considering candidates for leadership positions. Typically, we rely on the CV, which has all of the things that we just discussed, like prestige of institutions that one has worked in, but considering other metrics might promote more diversity. And again, it is the characteristics that allow someone to travel far, but also there have to be opportunities in order to achieve these good outcomes. And possibly, based on some things that we were talking about before, mentorship might be a good tool to use within those opportunities, either mentorship to find opportunities, to make opportunities, and to go for the available opportunities because of the other barriers that we talked about. So it's a combination of things that may improve diversity and leadership ability in our field. It's very important, and I want to say this loudly. I want to wave my arms and jump up and down to make this point that we aren't lowering standards. This is an argument that I have heard in the past when talking about changing criteria to something more in line with the distance travel model. But this isn't a lowering of standards to say we are going to admit everyone and let the chips fall where they may. That might be more akin to lowering standards, but with what I'm talking about here, it's the investment after the admission. It is the investment in training the students that we have deemed trainable. The question really is, who do we deem trainable, and who are we willing to invest in? Because just to admit everyone is not what this model means, and it isn't going to be effective because we have to retain people. This is beyond just admitting people for graduate school or internship or fellowship or putting them into a leadership position. It's about supporting people once they are admitted or put into that position. For students and trainees financially, that would be great. I know that that's a challenging one, but also beyond just the financial, supervision and mentorship of how to be successful in a higher academic system that may be unfamiliar to the person who shows great potential. Also creating spaces, particularly in leadership, creating a space in existing leadership for diverse student and trainee leaders, along with providing leadership development opportunities. Again, training people to be good leaders, investing in our historically underrepresented junior colleagues, and then providing this kind of support. So again, and I'm going to say this 1,000 times, just probably in the next 24 hours, it is not about lowering our standards at all. Plus, rethinking the leadership structure and the models that we use within our organizations. Typically in the past, diversity as a concept and as a committee has been siloed. Specific people, specific committees designated to work on diversity and to focus on diversity. And there is a new movement to have diversity more incorporated throughout. So instead of having a diversity committee, there is diverse representation on every committee, which does require, in many cases, restructuring of the existing structure within different organizations. There is also a new model, newish model for culturally informed leadership that can be implemented pretty well if there's mentorship and opportunities and a different model, which is asking to change a lot, but this could be very effective instead of siloing off diversity as a completely separate thing. That tends to maintain the idea that diversity is a footnote. If we have it, it's great, but it's not necessary for the system of academia that we have. And if we want to change that, then incorporating diversity into everything as opposed to treating it as a separate thing would be probably a better system, but a big change. Are we so different from other disciplines? The movement for greater EDI within psychology, particularly led by our organizations like APA, has been encouraging and seems to suggest that we are different from accountants and architects. Are we so different from other disciplines? typical psychology answer, yes and no. We do serve the mental health needs of our communities. And we do the research upon which interventions are developed to serve the mental health needs of our communities. So in that way, representation of those communities is increasingly important, and our understanding of all of the issues that impact these communities is also important. So in psychology, we do often follow medical school's lead, and distance traveled is a concept that is probably worth considering, given that we do have evidence that so far there are good outcomes. We have to keep in mind that we're not just diversifying the whole field, not just diversifying the whole field, but we're keeping up demographically with the population we serve. We serve the population, and representation matters. The temptation may be diversify the field and leadership will follow, but given the structures that are already in place and given the history of where psychology comes from, the nature of these issues being sort of circular in nature, trying to diversify both simultaneously, leadership and our general population of psychologists, may do more to create a more equitable psychology in a reasonable time while the US population is rapidly outpacing us in terms of diversity. I know that these are all pretty well discussed issues and barriers, and hopefully some of the suggestions are new. I know you are probably not unfamiliar with most of the issues that our field is struggling with, and I know that they can seem really overwhelming and cyclical and hard to break that cycle. That is part of why I chose water droplets for the backgrounds to my slides, to remind you and encourage you, don't underestimate what you as an individual can accomplish. These small changes create ripples throughout the field, and most of these changes are long overdue. I want to thank you all for your kind attention, especially because a lot of the barriers and the issues we're trying to overcome are probably well known to you. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss a little bit about what I know and what I think, and to encourage you to get involved. And even if you're hesitant, we would love to increase your involvement, whoever you are. So I want to say thank you again. And I know there are a lot of you out there in Zoom land, but I'm always willing to discuss these issues. Sometimes the semester is very chaotic and I won't get back to you, but if you would like to email me, I think all of this stuff is really important, and I think it's all going to take all of us working together. So I'm happy to discuss via email if anyone is interested.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Abram-Silva. This was quite interesting and full of information. One of the things that I appreciated about your presentation is that you actually gave us an outline of some steps that we can take so that we can not just be allies, but accomplices in making sure that change occurs, not just that we hear about it and know we should. So thank you very, very much for those specific pieces. We do have several questions I'd like to pose to you.
Fantastic.
So one of the questions is, could you speak more about different qualities of leadership appreciated by different cultures?
Yes. So like I said, sometimes they're in direct opposition to the mainstream culture, which tends to prioritize extroversion and a lot of talking. Whereas there are a lot of communities of color that prioritize listening and not speaking unless there's something very important to say in that moment. So there is a lot of gathering of information and of constituents, if you will, and then processing with very little output from the leader, which in our mainstream US society doesn't necessarily, it's not obvious that that is a leadership quality, the listening. Although as psychologists, like we probably already know that listening is very important. But this idea, we have speeches, we have debates in our national leadership, and that's a model that psychology tends to also embrace. But some qualities are quieter, and some leaders lead from behind. There is that concept of leadership as service, as opposed to like a figurehead. So these different types of models from different cultures may not seem obvious as being very useful in our modern sort of mainstream society. But I think that they have their benefits.
And I think what you just described links very closely to things that we're encouraged to do, like learn more about other cultures so that we understand what those leadership qualities are and how they can make all of our experiences more rich. If we aren't familiar with other cultures and why those are considered leadership skills, then it's harder to appreciate those. So,
Yes.
So, all right, here's another question. If factors such as grit and perseverance are effective ways of increasing diversity in admission to training programs, how are such factors best measured for purposes of admission?
This is a great question. This is a very common question that I get, because these are constructs that we don't have great definitions for, just even as psychologists. I mean, if I say grit, who knows what I actually mean? That is why I like the distance traveled philosophy of how far did a person have to travel socioeconomically to reach the point where they're applying to your grad school program. One of the things that we have in New Mexico is a need for, and I'm sure this is nationwide, a need for bilingual psychologists. But the factors that lead to a person being bilingual are also barriers to becoming a psychologist. So bilingualism is one of those metrics for distance traveled. Also, first generation college student. That is a good way to measure, for lack of a better term, grit or perseverance to get to this place. Can that predict success within a system that we already have? We have good evidence that it can.
Great, thank you. How do we speak to the projected decline in the general Black population in 2050?
How do we speak to it? I'm going to have to interpret that. Speak to it as not keeping up with the explosion of Hispanic population.
Right. What might explain it? How might we view it?
Gosh, I don't know what explains it, other than there are factors of particularly the Hispanic population that result in large families and getting larger. So I know what increases, why we see such an increase in the Hispanic population, but I'm not sure what would decrease or even just maintain the Black population, other than, really our climate in the last few years in particular, although I suppose it's just history-wide, there is a lot of violence towards certain groups of people that might result in populations being lower. I mean, I feel like as a Jewish person, I have an idea of what could reduce a population. But I also think there are socioeconomic factors that could contribute. Just struggling to get by may encourage people to, or I guess discourage people from having large families. I think that it's a complex issue.
It is. One of our audience members also said, unfortunately, incarceration may play a role in the Black community and the ability to build families. So, yeah. Okay, here's another one. I have a question regarding hardiness and grit. We know that SATs and GREs account for only about 1% of the variance in college. Do you know of any percentages or other data for hardiness and grit?
I wish I did. I think that this would be a great dissertation for anyone who is supervising students. I really think we should be doing more research on this because we are seeing good outcomes so far. And yes, the landscape is changing in academia as well. I think that all of the things that we have relied on to predict in the future what will happen, and I want to say some of this is because of the pandemic, but I don't think it's entirely due to the pandemic. The deck has been shuffled. So the predictions that we could have made 20 years ago about who would be successful, I think that may be outdated. And we need to do more research on how we can predict success now.
Right. There also is a question about, is there any data on professional schools of psychology versus university-based schools concerning degrees being awarded to minority students?
That's interesting. I didn't see anything stratified. I just saw psychologists. And I think that part of that is the movement to unify us. All of us are psychologists. I imagine someone somewhere has stratified it because admissions do tend to vary from model to model, but I haven't seen any. And I think that too might be a good dissertation.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a follow-up comment on the comment that I mentioned earlier, and that is, as a Black psychologist listening to this exchange, I would encourage us to be mindful of stereotypes, such as incarceration impacting a decline in the Black community. So just wanted to make sure that that was brought out as well.
Well, that's why I think that's why I think it's a complex. There are a lot of factors that play into it, and to try to determine one or two, I think it gives short shrift to everything that this particular population has to face.
Yeah. So I think in conclusion, again, I want to thank you for your presentation. I think that some of the highlights that we want to reemphasize are the importance of mentorship, the importance of allyship, as well as for us to keep looking for solutions, even when we don't know what the questions are. Being open to change and growth and development are very important. There's always another way that we can approach making change and increasing equity, diversity, and inclusion.